All right, welcome to our conversation on the French Revolution. As you can see, a lot is going on here, so it might take us a couple of videos to get through it all. So sit back and relax, make sure you have your notes out, and you're ready to take notes as we go. Unless you want to watch these videos a million times and memorize every word. Okay, so I think we have to go back and, remember the mindset of France and the various people in France before the revolution, right? So we can know why it was so revolutionary and why it was such a mess and so complicated. So I'm going to simplify it, but we could spend a long time talking about it. So we begin with this idea of the old regime, or as they would say in France, ancien regime. Hopefully that's not too horrible. So these are the four things I want you to keep in mind, especially as we go throughout the French Revolution and you wonder why people do the things they do. And this is true not only for France, but it's probably similar throughout Europe. But in some countries like England, right, things have been sort of fading out, some of these old regime ideas. But Central Europe, I think, is probably still looks somewhat like this as well. So, for centuries, right, you have the aristocratic elites who possess these inherited legal privileges. And so remember, even if these guys are poor, it doesn't matter, right? They can trace back their family lines forever, and it passes on from family to, from father to son, and so you inherit these privileges. And this probably is no surprise, right? The churches were closely intertwined with the state and with the aristocracy, so a lot of the leadership in the church in France, right, probably came from some of these families. So in our towns, right, in our urban labor force, our carpenters, our butchers, our bakers, they have guilds, right? And these guilds, you might remember from your study of the medieval period, they've lasted also for a long time, and they protected their crafts, protected the skills, and regulated all kinds of things, right? So they're not quite unions that in our modern context, but they operated somewhat like that, right? Serving as protection, but usually a lot of people felt maybe too constrained by the guilds because they regulated how you did something, and if you try to go outside of the lines, it could be tricky. And it was also organized also somewhat into family groups. So if your grandpa was a carpenter, you're most likely a carpenter or a blacksmith or whatever. So then we have, of course, the people at the very bottom, the rural peasantry, and they have been really paying the price for the luxury of these guys. And of course, you remember the dangerous tradition Louis XIV set up in the Versailles palace. So by the time we get to this point, they've been living the high life for quite some time, and somebody's got to pay for it, right? Okay, so all of the groups, right, are going to play a role in the revolution, and all of them will be dramatically impacted by what happens. So, but you might not expect how they react. But I think if you keep in mind some of these things, it might help us kind of understand that. So, some fun facts, right? This is what France is like, and frankly, all of Europe. So the 1700s is really the age of the aristocracy. So the 1600s saw the rise of these absolute monarchs, but then we see kind of the rise of the aristocracy, and really especially the French, right? The English, the Russian, a lot of other, the nobility in other countries will imitate the French aristocracy. Okay, so look at what we're talking about here, right? Sumptuary laws. They even regulated how you dressed. And so certain materials like silk, if you were a peasant farmer or an urban laborer, you could not buy silk and make an outfit out of it, even if you had the money. Now, there were rights, but it wasn't like my right as John Smith, or I guess in France it would be Jean Renault. Anybody? But it was based on that I was this guy from this village and I have a certain or a region of France and or so and so's my landlord. So we had rights as a group, but not as me, Jean Renault. Um, and so this I think is so important, right? Land was the basis for authority, right? The status and power of the nobility or the aristocracy. Remember, that's why John Locke says he thinks property should be a natural right, because John Locke was not nobility and he wanted to own some land. Now, this is what we have to keep in mind. You would think that the peasants want revolution, right? Because their lives are terrible, but they don't. It's really only the minority of the people, our expanding merchant class and our Enlightenment friends, the philosophes, these wealthy middle class professionals, doctors, lawyers. They have money and education, but because they are not this, they have no power, right? And no status because they can't own that. But if you feel bad for the peasants, don't forget, they rebelled all the time. Throughout the 1600s, they would rebel, right? They would say, hey, if you try to change stuff, don't do it. So they would make sure you go back to tradition. And if the landlords got out of hand, they would rebel. And if you change that price of bread, watch out. And they had a sense of justice, and if things were not fair or not just, they would rebel. And of course, paying feudal dues along with taxes and tithes to the church, etc. So I think if we keep this all in mind, right, we kind of understand why people do the things they do in the French Revolution. Okay, so this is, our feudal system that we've looked at. The breakdown of the families here, especially so we're looking at some of the nobility from the medieval period, and even if the money is here, right, it doesn't matter because they're not up here, and you're born into these social classes, and you'll stay there forever. So this is kind of a little medieval thing, but I think it is part of what is the Ancien regime. So I'm going to show you some pictures. You tell me if you can guess which class, which area of the feudal system do these people belong. Ready? Quiz yourself. Okay. Who do you think? All right. And? So, did you figure it out? Hopefully you picked nobility here. And the first one was our middle class. So you can see that they're wealthy, but maybe when you look at them next to the aristocracy, you get a sense of what's different. And this is what I'm talking about. See this clothing, right? That's the sumptuary laws would protect that. Okay, so here comes the Age of Enlightenment, which we've been talking about this week. And then, of course, what happens in our own country, which we talked about before this, so I'm going to skip the next little bit. Okay, so let's talk about the beginnings of the revolution. Okay, so what are the problems in France that have existed for a long time but really are coming to a boiling point? So first we have to keep in mind a huge social inequalities. And in France they call them the three estates, right? And so we have the clergy, which, something we forget, but they are actually the first estate. If you remember back to that triangle, the Pope and the church are at top, even above the king. And so you had two types of clergy, right? So you had the higher clergy, and these guys, like I said, were probably from aristocratic families. And then you had the lower clergy, parish priests, who might be from maybe middle class families, say, or maybe even, I don't know, wherever, maybe wealthy urban laborers or whatever. So, nobility, right? They're the second estate, and remember their power is based in the land. And then notice everyone else is in the third estate. So you have everybody from poor rural peasants to wealthy bourgeoisie. So here's a nice vocab word that we should know. Now, when we start talking about the wealthy middle class, we'll be fancy and say bourgeoisie. So these are the professionals that I was talking about. And this is why I think the French Revolution is messy, because this third estate, you've got a lot of people here at cross purposes. They do not all want the same thing, even though it seems like they would. Okay, so the first estate, here are our higher clergy, right? Cardinals, bishops, and then our parish priests. Our second estate, the nobility. Now, some of these guys, they'll complicate things because they are sympathetic to the third estate. They have read some of these enlightened books, and so they might also be wanting some change. And then the third estate, right? So the bourgeoisie, right, our wealthy middle class, they're really going to start leading this revolution, but you can imagine that they're not going to be on the same path as our peasants, or this is my urban laborer. Okay, so let's look at some stats and a cartoon to help us understand what's going on before the revolution. And this is a famous cartoon, and you may or may not see that on the SOL or tests or everything. So take a minute and think what's going on here, right? Who is carrying the burden of the excess of France? Excuse me. Okay, so, and then I think these are very revealing here. So here's the population of France, right? So the gray is our third estate. Here's the land ownership, right? So first estate, the church, nobility, and who pays the taxes? The entire third estate. So we've got, what is that, 1.52-ish% of the population owns 35% of the land. Something's not right here. And then they don't pay any of the taxes. So you can see why we're getting to kind of a boiling point on the eve of the French Revolution, right? There's these problems been around for a long time, but you know, what kind of pushes them over the edge? So the other problem, so problem number one, remember social inequalities. Problem number two, the King and Queen of France. These poor guys are at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so this is, ooh, there they are, older. So this is Louis XVI, obviously, and Marie Antoinette. She is the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa of Austria. Fun fact, Maria Theresa had like, I don't know, 14 kids and had maybe 11 daughters. I don't know. And they're all named, so her name is Maria Theresa. They're all named Maria something. And so she is Maria Antonia, or in French, Marie Antoinette. And so they're just not ready for this. You know, they're kind of frivolous people. I don't think they really get what's happening. They're living off in their Palace of Versailles. I think they have no concept of the realities of France, or you know, a lot of these guys, some of their nobility helped the Americans, and they're bringing back some dangerous ideas into France. And so by the time they've been king and queen for quite some time, here they are as a little bit older, but they just don't have, especially him, they just don't have the capacity to lead. And because she is Austrian, right, and a foreigner, the people will probably unfairly blame her. So you have the terrible quotes, let them eat cake and whatnot, which is probably not true, right? Propaganda. But heaven forbid you blame your actual king, but it's easy to blame the foreign queen. Okay, and the third problem is financial, of course. So once you have all of these kind of mixed together, that leads to French Revolution. So we have a series of bad harvests, right? Food shortages, blah. Add that to unemployment. Add that to financial aid that pretty much, well, brings the French treasury on the brink of bankruptcy. And all of this, plus our social inequalities, plus our bad leadership, will lead to the French Revolution. Okay, so how are you going to solve these problems? and we'll wait for our next video to describe this.